Hello, I am Tony Svejcar with the Agricultural Research Service and the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center, and I'm here to present an Eastern Oregon Ag Minute. Many of you are aware of the current ag research programs in Harney County, but few of us fully appreciate the long history of agricultural research in this county. The Harney Branch Experiment Station, located 5 miles east of Burns, was established in 1911. The primary objective of this research station was to determine which crops were suited to the high desert. The station was established because many of the homesteaders that settled this region were having a tough time making a living. Remember that at this point crop agriculture was fairly new to the area and there was no technical guidance. One of the early problems the experiment station and farmers faced was that rabbits liked these new crops much better than they did the existing vegetation. Without rabbit fencing, crop trials were impossible. Once the fences were installed, a wide variety of crops were tested under a dryland summer fallow system. Test crops included wheat, oats, barley, rye, flax, field peas, alfalfa, sunflowers, and root crops, as well as a host of unsuccessful specialty crops such as carrots, sugar beets, and kale. In spite of the success of some trials, homesteaders continued to leave the county, and in fact the entire region. By 1916, it was clear that dryland farming was not going to solve the economic woes of southeastern Oregon. Yesterday, I outlined some of the early dryland farming research in Harney County. By 1916, the program was beginning to shift from dryland to pump irrigation. It became clear that even limited irrigation could dramatically increase crop yields. Many of the crops that were grown successfully under dryland systems were tested again under irrigation. The reality was that even with good yields, the economics of production was such that irrigation practices were not adopted by farmers. The homesteaders continued to abandon their farms and move away. During the early years of settlement, there had always been a livestock industry in our region. One major advantage of livestock operations compared to row crop farming was low costs. Wages and food for cowhands were the primary expenses for raising cattle. In 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act brought all public domain lands of the West under management. The primary goal of the act was to stabilize the livestock industry and improve the range. But there was limited research on the best ways to accomplish the mission of the Taylor Grazing Act. This led to the third phase of agricultural research in Harney County. The third phase of agricultural research in Harney County focused on range, forage, and livestock production. This research got a boost in the 1930s when the experimental range just west of Riley was established. The early grazing service was instrumental in developing the experimental range. The passage of the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934 created a whole new era for western rangelands. There was a desperate need for information on rangeland and livestock management in the sagebrush region. The experimental range was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during 1935 to 1941. All the roads, fences, buildings, corrals, and other facilities were built largely with hand labor. The CCC was set up to provide employment for young men during the period following the Great Depression. Most of these young men were from larger eastern cities, so I imagine Harney County was something of a culture shock for most of them. By 1939, studies had been initiated at the experimental range and a rich history was beginning to build. But something was still missing, the flood meadows that were such an important part of most ranches. This week I've been outlining the history of agricultural research in Harney County. The concept for an experimental range was developed in 1934, and by 1939 studies were underway. In 1938, Harney County ranchers, working with the county extension agent, expressed the need for research on flood meadow improvement and methods for wintering cattle with meadow hay. An agricultural planning report published in 1938 outlined their needs. During the summer of 1940, a survey was conducted to find a meadow unit for the research center. As a result of the survey, land known as Section 5 was leased on June 1, 1941 for 10 years with an option to buy. In the spring of 1948, the property was purchased by Oregon State University. The property was about 660 acres and is still the headquarters and office complex for the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center. The location, 5 miles south of Burns on Highway 205, has been used continuously for research since 1941. This week, the subject has been the history of agriculture research in Harney County. I've identified 3 distinct phases of agriculture research. 1, dryland farming from 1911 to 1916, pump-irrigated farming from 1916 to about 1944, and range forage and livestock research, 1939 to present. So where are we now in terms of agriculture research? I think we have made another transition. Although we still do range, forage, and livestock research, the shift has been from production to ecologically based research. Our focus now is on issues such as grazing impacts on sage grouse, juniper expansion, restoration of weed-infested rangelands, using grazing to modify vegetation structure, fire ecology, and so on. In some cases, the topics really have not changed, but the approach has. There has also been a shift in how we view our research domain. At one time, nearly all research was conducted on research center property. Now, I would say that probably over half of our research is conducted on land owned by cooperators, primarily private landowners and the Bureau of Land Management. Agriculture research has shifted over the years to meet the needs of the local community and society at large. The recent trend is to address environmental issues with less focus on straight production questions, and in general, we are being asked to take a much broader view than we have in the past. I'm Tony Svejcar. Thanks for listening.